welcome, Sat Bir. It's so lovely to have you here. Can you please tell us first a little bit about yourself, about your work, how you got to this stage in your career where you are at the moment?
Well, first of all, thanks very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be able to share with you. I began yoga practice back in 1971 as an undergraduate student at university. And my interest was in this whole idea of these deeper states of consciousness and positive psychological states. And as I began practicing, I noticed the changes that were taking place. And in a couple of years after that, after continuing practice, I actually moved into a yoga community, a yoga ashram, and began practicing as a lifestyle within a community. And at the time, I was an undergraduate at the university studying science. And I sort of finished my bachelor's degree and moved on. But then in the mid 70s, it occurred to me that I wanted to get back into science, but I wanted to get back into science with respect to yoga and these deeper states that people were experiencing. And so I went back, picked up some other undergraduate courses, and then engaged in a PhD program. And my ultimate goal was to begin studies on yoga and meditation and these deeper states. And so I got a PhD ultimately in neuroscience, and then did some postdoctoral work. Unfortunately, in the mid 70s and in the 80s, there were really no opportunities to do research on yoga in anyone's laboratory. No one was really doing this work that could support you. So I had to study conventional fields of neuroscience. Ultimately, I ended up as a research fellow at Harvard Medical School at Brigham and Women's Hospital. And I was studying sleep and biological rhythms. And then ultimately, our National Institutes of Health had a branch of called the National Center for Complementary and Integrative Health. And they were funding grants for complementary practices like yoga. And so I applied for a Research Career Award and was fortunate enough to get that. So that I started in 2001, really. So interestingly, the time between my intention to do research on yoga in 1975 and the time I actually started was a good 25 years. So patience pays in that regard. But knock on wood, fortunately, I've been doing research continuously since that time. And my laboratory has started with research in the field that I was in, which was sleep. And so we did a trial of yoga for chronic insomnia. But then I've moved on from there, and we've done a number of studies on anxiety disorders, performance anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, culminating in a trial on generalized anxiety disorder. But my lab has also studied other areas, of course, the sleep study. And then we've also branched into yoga in the workplace, and then finally yoga in the public schools. And the Yoga in the Public Schools initiative really started a little over 10 years ago, as I started to question what would be the most impactful place to study research on yoga. And it occurred to me that bringing it to the schools would be the best, because that's where you would get access to the entire generation. And so we were fortunate enough to get a number of studies done on the yoga in the schools, and I'm continuing at a lower level to research that whole area of yoga in the public schools.
What does work with public schools involve? What are you working on? How are you working with children in public schools? What's coming out of this? What do you expect?
Yeah, so the way we would approach this, research would be to approach a school. We'd have to have the funding in place, which we did in a number of instances. We were funded either by the Kripalu Center for Yoga and Health. We did get a grant from the National Institutes of Health, specifically for evaluating risk factors for substance abuse. So the way we would conduct these studies is that we would identify a school that was interested in having us come in and teach yoga to their students, and do it in such a way that we could have sort of what's called a randomized controlled trial. So we'd have a control group of kids that didn't practice, and then the yoga group that practiced. And then we'd apply the yoga either over a semester, maybe 2 to 3 classes per week, or over the entire school year. And then we would compare how the kids were doing in both groups. And our measures were measures particularly of psychological state. So we were looking at things like stress, resilience to stress, mindfulness, mood state like anxiety, depression, anger, behavioral indications, and so on. And so what we would do would be to administer these self-report questionnaires before the program, and then we'd have the control group just continue with their regular classes. In most cases, we were replacing one of their physical education sports classes with yoga. And depending upon the school, it was either 2 or 3 classes per week. And then at the end of the program, after, in some cases, we did up to 32 classes over the course of the year or the semester, we then came and did the same outcome measures, the same questionnaires. And then we came back 6 months later in some studies to look at a long-term follow-up to see if the changes had manifested. Now, the results were a little bit up and down, as it is in this field, because this is really a brand new field of research, and we're just getting our feet wet in terms of understanding how to do this kind of research. But what we found was, generally speaking, improvements in stress and resilience, and changes in mood state. And then we also did qualitative studies in which we interviewed the students, and what we found was that they were achieving the kinds of changes that we see in adults. Improvements in regulation of stress and emotion, improvements in mind-body awareness, improvements in physical health, and then even deeper sort of experiences of sort of peace and positive psychological states.
There are just so many conflicting demands, both on parents and on children, and very often those families kind of fall apart. How can yoga help families to bring them together, to cement those relationships together?
Well, I think one way that can happen with yoga is basically through the way yoga works. Yoga basically makes you function better on multiple levels. And the levels that are most important for interpersonal interaction and communication and relationships is really helping you to cope with stress and emotion. Because when you're chronically stressed, or when you're not reacting well to your emotions, then that's when your relationship communication starts to break down as well. Because relationships require people to be relaxed. I mean, you're communicating better when you're relaxed, when you're open. But when your central nervous system is all tied up with chronic stress and with strong emotions that you're not capable of dealing with, that interferes virtually with every kind of human functioning, whether it's schoolwork or whether it's communicating in relationships. And in children, oftentimes you'll see that it's very indirect. So a child will be misbehaving and it's not clear why, and there's some kind of tertiary reason for that being in place, but the child is acting out as though it was related to the instance at hand, but in fact it may be problems at school, it may be problems at home, it may be problems with other children, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's really the strongest place. And then the whole idea of increasing mind-body awareness is really a critical feature. This is also known as mindfulness. As you become more mindful of how you speak and how you listen and how you attend to things, that's obviously going to improve communication as well. Relationships are all about communication. The more you can communicate effectively and kindly, the better the relationship is going to be. And so that applies not only to families, but also to other situations where there's communication. And so that could be in the workplace as well.
That change started with me as soon as I calmed down, the kids calmed down as well. And then we could have that really level conversation rather than who shouts louder or who is stronger. So that makes me wonder whether if families or if parents realize the benefits of the scientific benefits of practicing yoga, would it help them engage into the practice better, and would it help them to bring the kids on the mat as well? What is your opinion about it?
Yeah, I think understanding how yoga works, which we call research literacy, is really understanding the mechanisms and the psychophysiology of how yoga works, I think is very convincing. What I'm really surprised when I give lectures to people who've been practicing yoga for a long time, and I go through all the science and the scientific rationale for how yoga works and how it affects the brain and how it affects the nervous system and how it affects our hormones and so on. And then people's responses, gee, I'm going to start practicing yoga more steadily. And, I didn't teach them any yoga. I just talked about how it works and showing the evidence for it's working. And somehow that seems to make people recommit to their practice as though the experience wasn't enough, which is surprising to me. But I think it does have value. And it has particular value, especially for yoga teachers, because this is what you can implement within your yoga teaching to explain how these things are working. And it's very simple. A lot of the science is actually very simple in terms of how thought processes and emotion and stress regulation work.
I'm talking to mums, I'm talking to dads, and very often they say, right, it's all great, but how am I going to get this kid on the mat and practice with me? Do you have any super formula or advice to the parents?
Well, the actual teaching and practice with kids is a whole specialty area. And, I'm actually a researcher. I never even saw the children or saw the classes. I was the research director. So I'd sit in my office and deal with the yoga instructors and deal with the research assistants and the postdoctoral fellows who were actually on the ground with the kids, teaching them. And teaching kids how to practice yoga is not the same as teaching adults how to practice yoga. You have to be able to teach them in a way that they will engage, because if they don't engage, they're not going to practice. If they don't practice, then it's a waste of time, and they can go through the motions and not get any benefit out of it. So there is a very specific way to do this, and there's a lot of actual programs out there in which yoga teachers can go and take a training program in how to teach yoga to children and how to teach yoga in schools. There's a lot of books out there. There's DVDs. And so it's a very specialty area. And it gets even more specialized the younger you go. So if you start to teach toddlers or preschoolers, that's another area and the yoga you're teaching there is very different than the yoga you'd be teaching to 17 or 18-year-olds. So it really is a specialty area. In terms of a family, unless the father or the mother who's trying to promote this has some sense of how best to engage their kids, it could be difficult. But fortunately these days there are a lot of DVDs, there's a lot of online programs, and there's a lot of yoga studios that are offering yoga for children and adolescents. So fortunately, there's a lot of resources to be able to tap. In terms of yoga in schools, for example, there's actually a book called Best Practices for Yoga in Schools. And the purpose of that book is really to explain how to do this, how to teach, how to get across the information, how to deal with the schools, how to implement the programs, etc. And as I say, there's a lot of books on teaching yoga to kids. So, and I think the best way to go into this is in an informed way. So the more skilled you are in conveying the yoga to the children, the more likely they're going to engage in it.
I was also thinking about that relationship between parents and children. So if parents want to do it, the children are more likely to follow. So what would you say to the parents? Why should they practice yoga? For the sake of their children?
Right. Well, exactly. And of course, the parents are going to benefit just as the kids are. The improvements that we see in kids are the same as the improvements we see in adults. And we know that adults are under chronic stress. I mean, our society is under chronic stress. I mean, just the pandemic has obviously made this much worse, but even before the pandemic, we had an epidemic in chronic stress. So things have ramped up even greater with the pandemic. But most people in our society have not learned these basic skills that come with yoga practice. These are actual skills. These are behavioral techniques that we've learned in yoga. These are techniques that allow us to cope with stress effectively, that allow us to deal with our emotions, that allow us to become more sensitive, more aware, more mindful, and then even experience these sort of deeper, calm, peaceful, unitive states. As well as improving our physical functioning and our breathing, everything else. So yoga works in a sort of a very global way to improve all kinds of functioning. So if a parent says, well, I want my kid to practice yoga, but I'm not going to bother with it, well, I don't think that's going to work so well, because the children really are not foolish. They're going to know, well, this parent is trying to, push this on me, and obviously this parent doesn't think it's worthwhile enough for him or her to practice it. And we see this phenomenon in schools, in fact. So if we come into a school setting, we bring in the yoga instructor, and if the teacher who has to be present in the class is sort of marking papers and sort of looking as though the teacher doesn't have value in this, the children pick up on that. So there's a whole idea of what your peers value. And so if the adults value it and practice it, then the kids are going to notice that and say, well, they value it enough to practice it. It must be good. I'm going to practice it too. So I think the whole peer idea is really important.
So in terms of development of young minds, from your experience, from your research, how do you think yoga supports development of young minds?
Well, I mean, it's as simple as giving them the skills. These are skills that currently are not in our society. They're not part of our culture. They're not taught in schools, these skills. They're not taught in medical communities. They're not taught in families. They're not part of our culture. They don't exist. We don't have this. It's not in our education curriculum. But these are very discrete skills. And they come from the basic practices of yoga, not just the asanas, the postures and the exercises, but the breathing techniques, the deep relaxation practices, and very importantly, the meditative component of yoga practice. All of those four sort of components are really not within our society. In our schools, the best that the kids get will be physical education. And most of that is sports, and most of that is focused on muscular performance. And it's not really targeted in a way of sort of self-control of your internal physical body or your mental state. And that's exactly what yoga does. Yoga allows you to experience your body in a different way. You become more sensitive to your body. This increase in mind-body awareness. This comes from the practice of meditation, of focusing your attention. And so in a yoga class, the yoga instructor will be saying, pay attention to what you're doing. Feel your body. Feel how it feels. Feel the muscles. Feel the burning sensation. Feel the sweat coming down. Be aware of your body. Be aware of the posture. Come into your body. Notice your body. Don't let your mind wander. Keep bringing your focus back, or focus on the breath. This continuous practice of meditation is what really tunes up your attention networks in the brain. You become better at holding your attention, at focusing your attention. And that means you become better at attending to everything in life, including, cognitive performance. So, for example, if you're a student in a school and you're trying to study a subject, you become better at holding your attention to be able to acquire new concepts and new ideas. You also become more sensitive to your body, and that can change behavior. And it changes behavior in a very important way these days because of we have this epidemic of non-communicable disease, which comes from these risk factors of poor dietary choices and sedentary behavior. And when you become more aware of your mind and body, you become more sensitive to the reaction of what you eat. You become more sensitive to the reaction of what you do with your body. So, we have this sort of epidemic going on, and it's resulting in obesity and diabetes in our kids of these low levels of physical activity and poor dietary choices. Kids are eating junk food and they're not exercising and they're not playing outside. And as you practice yoga, you become more sensitive to your body, as I said. And so that means that before you practice yoga, you eat junk food and you don't think anything about it. You practice yoga for a few months, and then you go back and you eat that junk food, and you experience that junk food and its negative impact on your feelings. You don't feel good when you eat that kind of junk food. And when you experience that, it could be a surprise because you say, geez, I used to eat junk food all the time and it never bothered me. Now I can't stand eating it because I'm too sensitive. I've become too aware of my body. I have to eat vegetables because they make me feel better. And the same is true with exercise. You sit on the couch all day long and you say, geez, I used to be able to sit on the couch all day long with no problem. But after a couple of months of yoga, my body wants to move and I feel better when I move. I feel awful when I sit all day. And so I'm more prone to engage in activity. So this is the way, this increase in mind-body awareness can actually change behavior. It's from the ground up. It's from the bottom up. It's not from the top down, like the doctor says, exercise more, eat the right foods. This is the top-down model in modern medicine. It doesn't work very well for lifestyle change. But when you change your mind-body awareness, you change this from the bottom up. You want to do these things, and you want to avoid the other things because of the rewards and the pain associated with the positive and negative behaviors, respectively. So this is the beauty of this. And we've got an anecdote from one of our interviews with some of the students in the schools. And one student said, I no longer eat junk food like ice cream and candy. And this comes out of this increase in mindfulness. So this is the beauty of this. You're changing actual behaviors.
You mentioned about sport performance. I wonder whether you come across evidence that will actually show that kids that practice yoga do better at sport, and if yes, how does it work?
Yeah, there's multiple ways in which yoga can impact sports performance. In fact, there's a number of clinical trials that have shown in some sports activities, a higher level of acuity, a higher performance level in terms of sports. So, for example, there's one study of basketball free throw showing that when kids practiced yoga and meditation, they improved their scores on the free throw. And the idea here is that first of all, and again, comes from these four elements of yoga practice: the physical postures and exercises, the breathing techniques, the deep relaxation, and the meditative component. So first of all, yoga practices are different than Western type aerobic exercises because they're focused much more on flexibility, isometric exercises. Mm-hmm. And so that adds an element that aerobic type exercises don't add. And one of the elements is the physical tension and relaxation is released a little bit more when you do these types of yoga exercises. If your body is less tense and your muscles are less tense, you have more control over them. That means your physical performance is going to actually improve. Another aspect that's very important is respiration. A lot of people don't breathe very, fully. As a modern society, we're under chronic stress, and chronic stress tends to lead people to very shallow breathing as we become anxious. And we no longer sort of have this deeper breathing pattern, and it's faster and it's shallower. And the normal breathing pattern is deeper and slower. And with these yoga practices, with long, slow, deep breathing that you practice in yoga, you actually change your respiratory functioning. And respiratory functioning affects stress. It affects emotion. It affects the central nervous system. It's a much more efficient way of breathing, which means that you're exchanging oxygen and carbon dioxide more effectively. That's going to affect physical performance as well and sports performance as well. In fact, one example of that is in mountain climbing. When you are at high altitudes, if you engage in long, slow, deep breathing, you're going to keep your oxygen levels higher than if you're breathing more rapidly and more shallowly. And so that's going to have applications in sports when, you go through a very vigorous period of time and you're gasping for breath. If you practice slow breathing, your body is going to do that gas exchange more effectively, and you're going to improve your performance. Another aspect that's really important for sports is the emotional and cognitive component. In all sports, you're using your eyes, you're using your ears, you're using your acuity to then make performance. So there's psychomotor, and then there's sensory performance. And when you practice the meditative components, you become more sensitive. The more sensitive you are, the more you're going to process the incoming sensory information accurately and thoroughly. And you won't be missing that by interference from stress and emotion. This whole idea of emotion regulation in sports is really critical, especially in competitive sports, because if you get too angry and too emotional, your performance actually declines. So the whole idea is regulating your emotion and your stress in the appropriate way so that you optimize sports performance. Because the whole idea of chronic stress and emotion can interfere with your activity. It engages whole mechanisms in the brain and prevents the brain from doing what you want it to do, because the brain is tied up with all of its resources in trying to cope with the stress and the emotion. So it can actually improve performance. And then finally, the other way that I think that's not insignificant is prevention of injury. Because yoga makes the body more flexible, and that increase in motion and mind-body awareness means that you're moving the body more appropriately. And you're moving in such a way that you're more aware of your movements. Because a lot of injuries in sports are coming from, an accident that, you put your foot in the wrong place or in the wrong way. And the more sensitive you are about how your body is moving, about proprioception, about your body in space, the less you're going to be prone to putting your body in a situation that's more prone to injury. And then even if you do step out of bounds where you get injured, that injury is going to be less severe because your muscles and your bodies and your tendons are more stretched out with the yoga practice. You're more flexible, you're more supple. So prevention of injury is not insignificant with respect to sports performance.
So in terms of duration of the practice or length of the practice or repetition of the practice, what would you recommend in terms of how long the kids or families should practice, and how quickly would you be able to see the effects?
So, this is going to vary from individual to individual. And, we don't have a lot of research yet on this kind of sort of dose response of how much you need and how long you need to practice it to get benefit. So, you can obviously sort of create some boundaries within which you're pretty safe. So if you say to someone, well, if I practice 15 minutes a week, am I going to notice any change in my, functioning? And the answer, as everyone will probably say who's practiced any yoga, no, that's probably not enough. And then if someone else says, well, do I need to practice 3 hours a day in order to achieve something? No, you'll get it much less than that. So we know that it's in between those bounds. Where it is in between those bounds is the other issue. And it's going to vary, as I say, by individual to individual. But, from my personal experience, when I was first starting yoga practice, if I was practicing, say, one yoga class, one hour yoga class per week, I would notice a subtle difference over time. If I was practicing twice a week, it was right in my face. It was very clear and very strong. If I was practicing 3 times a week, I was making progress and I was really changing in a significant way. So the more often you practice, the better it is. And then there's a balance. Do you want to practice 3 hours once a week, or do you want to practice a half an hour 4 days a week? What's the difference between that? And I think regularity is important. So regularity and then long-term practice. In terms of changing behavior, changing function, it takes time for the body to adjust, to make those kinds of changes. Because you're changing activity, you're changing brain structure, you're changing body structure. This takes time. So typically, you would want to, wait in the order of weeks and months to anticipate sort of longer term changes. But it depends upon what you're looking for. I mean, if you're looking for sort of an immediate sense of well-being and relaxation, you can get that in 10 minutes. You can get that in 5 minutes by doing a long, slow, deep breathing practice with meditation on the breath. That comes immediately, certainly over a single yoga class. But if you want to develop the skills of resilience to stress, of stress coping, of stress tolerance, of calmer emotional reactivity, that's going to take more time. That's the kind of thing that now takes weeks and months of practice to become established. And then if you want the real deeper stuff, where you're talking about a change in sort of life purpose and meaning, in a sense of life perspective, of goals in life, of what we might call sort of pure spirituality, that's going to take much more regular practice. Now we're talking typically more like months and years of practice in terms of achieving those sort of deeper experiences.
Okay, well, so that's really reassuring to know that you don't have to that you just take one step at a time, that you focus on that effort in small steps rather than making a massive revolution in your life, which is probably not really sustainable. But if you kind of gradually grow your appetite, that's better approach, isn't it? How yoga, how meditation, in your experience, can help kids to deal with their anxiety, with stress, and there is that growing problem globally, where it's not just the adults that gets overwhelmed with stress, but also children. And we're watching those frightening statistics where even 12 years olds are on antidepressants. So how can yoga and meditation help, and how can it be seen as a preventative measure?
So yoga works both on the mind as well as on the body. And that comes from those 4 basic practices: the physical postures and exercises, the breathing techniques. Those are working directly, and then the relaxation techniques. Those 3 are working directly on the body. And then the meditative component is working directly on the mind. But all of those things are working on the mind and on the body as a whole as well, because we have this connection between mind and body. Whatever goes on in the mind is manifested in the body, and vice versa. So when we're talking about people with anxiety, or even anxiety disorder, for example, it's not just in the head, it's in the body as well. So if you manipulate the body, you can affect what's going on mentally. And if you change what's going on mentally, you can affect the body. And the beauty of yoga is that it's got both the mind and the body techniques, whereas meditation alone is just a cognitive practice. It's just the mind. And then physical exercise, aerobic exercise, is just the body. But yoga works on that interface, and the practices within yoga are covering both extents. So, for example, when we get tense, when we get stressed, we hold tension in the body. So yoga allows us to become aware of that tension, release that tension in the body. The breathing techniques are very powerful. Breath regulation in humans has direct and immediate impacts on our central nervous system. It's wired in. So when you start to breathe slowly, those regions of the brain that are involved in stress and emotion regulation, they downregulate, they decrease and calm down. So when you do breathing exercises, you're actually affecting the brain itself, which then affects the mind. So that's working from the body to the mind to allow that stress and emotion coping to take place. Now, the way meditation works is very simple. Meditation, very simply defined, is the relaxed focus of attention. Now, there's many different styles of meditation, and they differ mostly in what you're focusing your attention on. So in yoga, the most common form of meditation is what we call single point focus meditation, or concentrative meditation. You're focusing on a mantra, you're focusing on a word, you're focusing on a sound, you're focusing on A candle, you're focusing on the breath. It's a single target. And what you do is you maintain your focus on that target. Now, what happens in meditation is that after a certain period of time, and this happens to everyone who's meditating, regardless of how experienced they are, you notice that your mind slips into mind wandering. So you're sitting in the room and you're focusing your attention on the breath. And then after 15, 20 seconds, a thought pops into your head, something, it's very innocent. Jesus, warm in this room. Well, I guess I better check the thermostat. Oh yeah, the thermostat, I have to check the heating bill. Oh yeah, the bills, I have to talk with my boss about getting that raise. Oh yeah, the mortgage. Geez, I got to pay the mortgage somehow. And then the next thought is, aren't you supposed to be meditating? And then you notice that you've been on this whole train of thought. And what you do in meditation is that you let go and bring your focus back to the breath. Now, this happens over and over and over and over again. Now, of course, a lot of the content of this mind wandering, which we experience all day long, every day, a lot of it is really focused on survival issues, which is stressful. So in that example I gave you of paying the mortgage and, the heating bill, these are stressful thoughts, and they generate stress and anxiety mentally and physically. So when you bring your focus, at least for the time that you're focused calmly on the breath, you're not thinking about that stuff. So it's kind of like a holiday. So at least for the amount of time you're successfully holding that, you're in a peaceful state. But what's more important here is that over time you're learning the skill of regulating your attention. You're noticing the mind wandering, and you're bringing your attention back to the target, whatever it is, candle, word, or the breath. And that generates the skill of control of attention. Now, control of attention means control of thought processes. And what happens over time is that you end up changing your relationship to your own thought processes, in which you have more control over your thought processes. And what happens is a realization. And that realization is that, hey, I have thought processes, but that's not who I am. I am something above those thought processes because I notice those thought processes. I can stop them, and I can change my relationship to them, and I can change my reactivity to those thought processes. This state we call metacognition. And metacognition is a very powerful state. It's actually the most powerful form of psychotherapy used today. And the basis behind that is that most of the psychological conditions that we have are due to thought processes. So in anxiety, it's anxious thoughts. In depression, it's depressive thoughts. So when we start to develop this self-regulation of our thought processes, we become masters of our own minds, of our own emotions. And so now, when we have a thought of, gee, how am I going to pay the mortgage? We now have the opportunity to say, hey, that's just a thought. It's not real. It's a thought. I had that thought. That's interesting, but I'm not going to react to it right now. I'm busy doing other things. You now have the opportunity to change your relationship to your own thought processes. That's how stress and emotion regulation manifest cognitively through the practice of these meditative techniques. You become master of your own emotions and of your own thoughts. You change your relationship to them. And that makes all the difference. So you're no longer, your behavior is no longer automatic. So in the case of children, one sibling hits another, and then there's an immediate reaction, that sibling hits back. And what we hear when we start teaching kids in schools, they come back with anecdotes, and they say, my brother took something from me and I was going to hit him. But then I stopped and took a few deep breaths and decided not to. That's the manifestation of self-regulation of stress and emotion. And that changes anger. It changes, all these other negative emotions, because you now have the skill of self-regulation. And many people in society don't have that skill. I'm sure you've seen people who, one thing little triggers them and suddenly they're in a rage and, they're out of control. So the purpose of these practices, these behavioral skills, is to manage that self-regulation. You're more under control.
heard you talk about connection between yoga, meditation, and children's or people's mental health and immunity. Can you explain how it works? Because especially these days when we have COVID pandemic still hovering above us, this is just so important to understand mechanics behind it.
So there's a whole field of research that's developed over the past 3 decades. It's called psychoneuroimmunology. So the psycho and neuro, the psycho refers to the mind, the neuro refers to the nervous system, and immuno refers to the immune system. Mm-hmm. And so implied in that term, psychoneuroimmunology, is the relationship between immune function, mental processes, and the central nervous system. Mm-hmm. And what we now know is that there is a very tight relationship between our immune function and our emotional state. So when we are under chronic stress, immune function is immediately impaired. It's negatively impacted. So when we practice yoga, which then reduces the stress, you release that inhibition of stress on immune function, and immune function improves. So that is really critical. So people who are under chronic stress are actually more susceptible to catching an infectious disease, whether that's a cold virus or a flu virus or any other kind of infectious disease. Your immune system is impaired. Another indirect way in which that manifests is our sleep. And we now know that adequate sleep is important for maintaining immune function. In fact, when you don't get enough sleep, even in one night, your immune system is immediately impaired. So this means if you're not sleeping well, you're not sleeping enough out of choice or because of insomnia, your immune system is not functioning well. And what we know about yoga is that it reduces the stress response, which actually enables you to sleep more deeply and more soundly. And you become more aware of your need for sleep, so you respect your sleep need and you sleep adequately. So indirectly, yoga practice will improve problems with sleep, but it'll also improve your awareness of your need for sleep. And that means you're going to sleep better when you practice yoga. And then the sleep itself, of course, is maintaining immune function. So, for example, it was an interesting study that was recently published in the UK with military trainees. And what they did over a period of months is that they looked at how long all of these trainees were choosing to sleep. And they looked at the frequency of cold viruses that they had caught. And what they found was a huge increase in the frequency of colds in those individuals that were sleeping less than 6.5 hours a night.
My goodness.
So it's very straightforward, this relationship between stress and sleep and immune function. So the more you can reduce your stress response and keep that under self-regulation, the better your immune system is going to function. And the immune system has two components. One is immunity to disease. The other one is inflammation. It's part of the same system. Inflammatory response is, in a sense, an immune response. And what happens in COVID, for example, is this huge inflammatory response, which can actually impair functioning. And so yoga has been demonstrated to actually reduce inflammation.
You mentioned earlier about talking about meditation, about self-regulating, self-regulation and self-regulation skills. Could you talk a little bit more about what those skills are, how kids can learn them, and how then this can in turn improve their behaviors?
Well, as I said, it's automatic. As soon as they start to become more aware, their bodies relax, the behaviors automatically follow that. You know, the change in the relationship to your own thought process is what's the really remarkable thing. You no longer are triggered by things that you were triggered by before. And it's a sense of change in perspective. Especially when you start to experience these deeper, peaceful states of consciousness. And these are very profound unitive states where you feel sort of at one with everything, a sense of calmness and peace and flow. And then when you experience that deeper state, which tends to be a very deep and profound state, and then you experience something minor like, well, your checkbook's out of balance, the change in perspective makes a difference, because you've just come out of this huge unitive experience that's so profound, and now you come across this little trivial thing of the checkbook being out of balance, and your response is now appropriate. It's just a little checkbook thing. I'm going to take care of it. It's not a problem. But before you were experiencing these deeper meditative states, that was the kind of thing that flew you into a rage or a bout of anxiety, because you were overreacting to this. So it's a sense of perspective as well. And when you start to experience these deeper unitive calmness states, it puts the rest of life into a different range.
So a little bit more scientific view now. I've been looking into genes and molecular biology and how they are influenced by yoga practice. And there's just, absolutely fascinating area. So can you explain how this works, particularly on younger people, and why is it so important?
Well, it works not only on younger people, of course, it works on everybody. So we have DNA, we have our genes, we've inherited certain gene set from our ancestors, and there are many, many genes that control all of the functions in the brain and in the body. And we can change the activity of those genes. We can't change the genes themselves. We've inherited those. So you have, certain skin color, you have certain eye color, you have certain height, et cetera, et cetera. That's coming from your ancestors. And so you have genes for all of that, but you also have genes for every function in the body. There's genes that can control your glucose regulation. There's genes that control your fat regulation. There's genes that control the nervous system, et cetera. Everything is controlled by these genes. These genes produce proteins and molecules, which ultimately are the workers that do everything in all of the cells of the body. Now, what we know is that we can change gene activity. We can change the activity of specific genes. So, in a sort of a gross example, we know that behavior can affect gene activity. So we know that there's genes that can be turned on that will produce a cancer tumor. So if you want cancer, go ahead and start smoking 4 packs of cigarettes a day, and you will start increasing the activity of cancer genes. And there's no guarantee you'll get a tumor, but you will definitely be increasing the expression of those genes, and therefore the likelihood that you will get cancer. Now, we know the opposite is true as well. We know that if you eat a lot of fresh vegetables, avoid a lot of processed foods, avoid a lot of pure sugar, eat lots of vegetables, and engage in appropriate physical activity, that we're going to increase the activity of genes that are good for you and downregulate those same cancer genes. So thereby reduce the odds that you will get cancer. Now, yoga is good for you in that sense that we see all these behavioral changes. Those are coming essentially through these changes in gene expression. As we are, improving our, emotion regulation or our stress regulation, we're changing genes as well. So in terms of immune function, we're seeing genes that are responsible for immune function being upregulated. We're seeing genes that are responsible for inflammation being downregulated. We're seeing genes that are being responsible for the stress response being downregulated. And so what we're seeing on the molecular level, in terms of genes and gene expression, is what we see behaviorally. And it's no surprise, it makes sense. But what this really tells us is that these practices are not just superficial. These are going down to the level of our cells and the levels of our gene expression. So when we practice yoga, we're changing gene expression and we're changing the functions at that molecular and cellular level.
What would need to happen to bring yoga to schools more widely?
So, this goes back historically, and you can look at the genesis of schools. And schools, formal schooling was started largely with the goal of educating children for the purposes of getting a job in the future, for having a career. And they have largely stayed at that. So the goal of a school is to get a job when you graduate. You're educated. You can speak the language, you can write, you can read, you understand history, you understand, some science, depending upon what your profession is. So it gives you the skills of becoming a functional worker in society. What we do not have in our schools is what's called, and what has now been termed, socio-emotional learning. This is the ability to self-regulate internal emotional state, to become aware of our internal state, to learn how to communicate, and to have these sort of social skills and emotional skills that are effective for becoming a healthy individual emotionally and in terms of stress and other kinds of behavior. These skills are currently not present in our schools. There is a whole movement called socio-emotional learning, and there's a consortium called the Consortium for Academic and Socio-Emotional Learning. And the idea is that schools need to start implementing these skills as well as the job skills that we need through teaching science and mathematics and so on and so forth. It's a movement that's starting to gain some ground, but by and large, it's difficult progress because the schools are in a situation where they're claiming that they don't have enough time to teach the kids all the skills they need to get the job. We're competing with China, for example, to get enough of the skills into the kids. And so if we're going to bring these socio-emotional skills to our children, if we're going to bring yoga into the schools, we're going to have to take something out, unless you lengthen the school day. But, that's not going to happen. So the justification for bringing yoga into the schools has to be made. And so a school district supervisor or a principal in a school is not going to be able to say, I'm going to bring in yoga and we're going to shorten math and we're going to shorten science and we're going to shorten phys ed to bring the yoga in. There's going to be a reaction to that. And the reaction is going to be, how can you justify this? These kids need more science. They need more math. How do you justify this? And there is justification. And the justification is in the fact that our kids are not coping with stress and emotion effectively. We have high prevalence of behavioral disorders in our kids. We have substance abuse. We have bullying. We have high incidences of depression and suicide. We have anxiety. We have attention deficit disorders. We have obesity in our kids. There are huge problems, especially mental health problems in our kids. There was a study that was done in the United States in which they followed children from the age of 9 to 19 and found that the odds of a child having a bona fide psychiatric condition was 80% over that period of time. So it's really universal in our children that they have this high propensity and high level of psychological challenges in childhood and adolescence. And socio-emotional skills prevent these disorders. They give the children the skills to prevent the incidence of these diseases, as does yoga. So what we need to do is to convince the policymakers that yoga, first of all, is capable of preventing these diseases, giving these kids skills, and that it's worthwhile. So that's going to take research because, anecdotes won't work. You can't go to a school principal and say, I've taught my kids yoga and they're much better, so you should put it in the schools. And he's going to say, well, I don't believe you. That's not scientific. That's an anecdote. I mean, you were lucky or you have a special relationship to your kids or whatever. So you need scientific research. You need to bring the studies, put them in the schools, and show that you are changing things, showing that you can improve academic performance because you're improving emotion and stress regulation, showing them that you can reduce injury in their sports activities, showing them that they can reduce behavioral problems in the schools, showing them that they're increasing their grades and their academic performance. So this is how you bring this into the schools. It's through the research. That's what's really critical. And so that's what my laboratory's been dedicated to. And we've published a number of papers on studies that we've done. In fact, we've even published a paper of a scientific rationale that just explains what I explained for the rationale for bringing yoga into the schools. And it makes sense. I mean, even if we can reduce the suicide rate, I mean, isn't that justification enough? So it's going to take time, but this is something that I think should be in the curriculum. Where else should we be learning these skills? I mean, we don't have these skills in our society. Doctors don't teach them. Parents don't teach them. I mean, the doctors are already saying, I'm so stressed, I'm ready to quit the profession. The poor school child goes to the teacher and says, I'm really stressed out. What am I going to do? And the teacher says, I don't know. I'm really stressed out too. I'm going to leave the profession. We don't have these skills. They're not available. They're not taught anywhere. That's why we're seeing this huge increase in the prevalence and the popularity of yoga practice. People are voting with their feet. They're finding through anecdotes and from their friends that yoga helped them deal with their stress and increase their performance as human beings. So this is what's ultimately going to make the difference of bringing yoga into schools. And I always like to imagine a thought experiment. Imagine that every school in the country has implemented yoga all the way from preschool to graduation of high school, secondary school. And imagine that happens for 3 generations. So now you have an entire society with these skills. So not only have you reduced the incidence of non-communicable lifestyle diseases like depression, anxiety, obesity, diabetes, hypertension, and heart disease, you've also made better functioning people. People who are less angry, that means less war, less violence. People who are less avarice, less greed, that means less poverty. You're not just talking about making better people, you're talking about making a better society. So this is this is not trivial stuff. We're really talking about utopia. And that's from making better people. When people function better, society functions better. And when everybody has these skills, that's when you see this global change. We've had, in some of our studies, we've studied with one school for a number of years, and we did some qualitative interviews with some of the school staff. And the school counselor said basically that yoga has changed our school. It's made our school a better place. He's talking about this global sense of a change in the entire school environment and the entire society within the school because the kids have adopted these skills and put them into their lives.
Have you observed that certain countries are more open to introducing teaching of yoga into school system than others, and what does it depend on?
Well, what it depends upon is it varies from country to country. India is a unique example. India is very proud of the fact that yoga came out of that culture. And a lot of Indian philosophy comes from this sort of yogic approach, these yoga philosophy bases. And so, India tends to be very proud. And so the whole idea of yoga in India is becoming very strong. In fact, as you may know, the Prime Minister of India is an avid yoga practitioner. So that has made the administration in India sort of really promote yoga in schools. And so we're seeing that being implemented much more easily in India than perhaps in other countries, because it basically was founded in that country. In other countries, it varies. And there are sort of two attitudes towards yoga, and they're both misperceptions of yoga. And one attitude is that yoga is just a form of exercise. It's just another form of exercise, so big deal. We've already got exercise. And the other one is, yoga is a religion. That's part of Hinduism. That's part of India. And if you practice yoga, you become a Hindu. And so that is the most immediate trigger for the whole situation with respect to church and state. Which is the fact that you're not allowed to bring religious practices into a school setting. And so we have states in the United States, for example, which have been dealing with this. Most recently in the news here has been the state of Alabama, which has had on their law books a prohibition for the teaching of yoga in public schools. They made it a law, and that was just recently rescinded. The idea being that it is not religious activity, because religious activity is based upon dogma, it's based upon beliefs. And yoga is not based upon dogma, it's not based on beliefs, it's based on practice. It's a mind-body practice. You manipulate the mind, you manipulate the body, and you have effects. It's a biological practice, it's not a religious practice. So these are issues that come up here and there. So different regions in the United States, you'll see more prevalence of yoga. In other regions, you'll see less prevalence of yoga. In different countries, you're going to see different responsivity. So, for example, in some Islamic countries, some of the Islamic leaders have actually gone on record to say that if you're a good Muslim, you will not practice yoga. It's become that extreme in some countries. But it really varies from country to country. What surprises me is the number of yoga researchers that are publishing research out of Iran. Mm-hmm. And it's astounding to me. There's more people publishing yoga research in Iran than there are people publishing yoga research in France. Now, I don't understand how that works, but it's really strange because, the Iranian Ayatollahs have basically said yoga is not for Muslims.
Right. So the last takeaway message for families, for mums, dads, for children about what yoga can bring into their lives individually, but also into their lives as a family. Some words of encouragement, if you could share, please.
Well, it's all about the practice. It's practice, practice, practice. But in terms of the practice, if you've never practiced yoga before, it's important to find the right practice, to find the right teacher, to find the right practices, because yoga has a lot of practices, a lot of different yoga styles, a lot of different yoga teachers, and all of those are going to give you a different experience. And different people react differently to different teachers, to different styles of yoga. So that's really critical, to identify the kind of yoga that suits for you. You can't just walk down the street, go to the first yoga studio you see, walk into the class and expect that that's going to be a fit. You have to shop. You have to find out. You have to do a little research. You have to try out different styles. But once you find the type of yoga practice that fits, it will become something that is regular for you. And you will want to practice it, and you won't want to miss your practices. That's when you know you've found the right mix, because that's going to guarantee that you're going to continue to be a regular practitioner. And the regular practice is what's really going to make these changes happen on the longer term. That's where you're going to see the changes in resilience to stress, in stress tolerance, in stress coping, in emotional regulation, in mindfulness and mind-body awareness, and even in these deeper spiritual type unitive experiences, these positive psychological states. You're going to experience more kindness, more gratitude, more compassion. And it all comes from practice. So practice, practice, practice. If you don't practice, it won't work. That's the fatal flaw of all mind-body practices, that you actually have to do something in order to get the benefit. It's not like popping a pill. You actually have to do the practices. If you do the practices, things will happen that will make you function better as a human being from A to Z, from your muscles and connective tissue all the way to your deepest experiences.
Sat Bir, it's beautiful. Thank you so much for the message, and thank you so much for saying that. That just sounds absolutely overwhelming, and especially those few takeaway messages, very, very powerful. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
So I'm really grateful for that. Thank you so much. It's been great talking to you. Thank you.